Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about modern experimental theater. Now, uh, because of the nature of kind of experimental theater as a reaction to kind of what the dominant mainstream is, these different kind of experimental theaters are going to have to do a little bit with each other, but each experimental theater is kind of experimental in its own kind of way, right? Some of them overlap, but don't think that when I'm talking about these different things that they are somehow there is a through line or a story that is being told from one to the other. So just so you know, and so the modern um, the modern theater, right? We're talking like even from realism from like the 1940s, post-war, even up till today. Um, Most theater, mainstream theater, is thought to be, in general, realism is the norm. Although it's not unusual, right? No one is going to say that if you have you know, uh, a magical element in your show that you are somehow being bold or anything, right? Um, but generally, realism. Generally, right? There is an established writer, director, actors, producing company, all these sorts of things, right? But different companies kind of play around with those at the margins. So we're going to talk first about kind of the the most famous iteration of uh, modern experimental theater. It's called the Living Theater. It was founded in 1947, by an actress, Judith Malina, and a painter, poet, Julian Beck. This image that you see here in the background, and also in my background behind me, those are both images of the Living Theater. Um, they were founded as kind of specifically with a sort of political ideology and agenda, as it were. They were very self-consciously an anarchist company, right? With communal decision making in the group, anarcho-communist politics, right? That were evident in their shows and in their later activism. But their various shows helped make Off Broadway and Off Broadway matter to the broader American culture, right? Before this, very, very rarely would non-Broadway theater actually percolate into the strains of American theater. But the Living Theater was one of the few companies, the earlier companies that actually happened, that did that. So what did they do? In form, they were very heavily inspired by our good friend Antonin Artaud, right? With his, if you remember, right, his theater of cruelty, talking about spectacle and about how a human being at its base is an animal, right? And humans, as specifically, are communal, right, animals that live in social groups, right? And that there should not be this hierarchy between people. There should not necessarily be a hierarchy between even performers and audience. And spectacle and almost kind of invented kind of modern ritual is a little bit of what they tried to cultivate. There was very little fourth wall, certainly not a physical separation, right, between the performers and the spectators. Um, Now, in 1963, these two were imprisoned due to tax fraud, which led to temporary closing of their space. One of the founders, Judith, defended Julian at the IRS hearing, dressed as Portia from The Merchant of Venice. Um, if you know the play The Merchant of Venice, the character of Portia, she at the very end she puts on the robes of a judge uh, at the very end of the play. It's very, between Shylock and Antonio and their pound of blood. Um, so very theatrical. They hosted performance art, poetry readings. Later on, they got a lot more into activism rather than simply kind of exploring theater as itself. Um, Now, this all may seem a little bit abstract, and so I'm going to share with you a little bit of a short snippet of a video of what a performance of the Living Theater looked like. Just one moment. Right now, pardon the pixelated nature. and the kind of up close stuff. But you can kind of see that there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people moaning and chanting over each other. It's not very necessarily clear where you should be looking, right? The human body as kind of its physical form takes precedent over any sort of costuming, right? There's very little kind of choreography as such, um, but there is kind of scripted movement. This theater actually got shut down a number of times. This particular play that you're watching is called Paradise Now. The performers actually disrobed a number of times during the course of the performance and got cited for public indecency. So that's just a little bit of, yeah, that's just a little bit of an idea of what the Living Theater was all about. All right, so now we get to another theater. Whereas the Living Theater was very much about what form the play would take, and you know, experimental in terms of the higher or the non-hierarchical nature of their decision-making process. We go on to another theater. They're still active today, actually. They're called Bread and Puppet Theater. Um, they are a politically radical puppet theater founded in the early 60s by this fella, Peter Schumann, also in New York City. They were very active during anti-war protests against the Vietnam War. They would show up to these anti-war marches with these huge, giant puppets, kind of performing a play while marching. Their name derived from the theater's practice of sharing fresh bread with the audience, which they did to establish a sense of community. And they are still active today. I also have, if you want to see kind of the scale of these puppets, because this is a puppet theater scale that you have not seen before. Just one more. Right. So this took place in July of 2012, as you can see. Right. You can see the puppeteers. Wearing white, incidentally, which is very different from a lot of the other puppeteers that we've seen earlier. And so Bread and Puppet Theater very much experiments with, well, puppetry and scale and awe that can be created by these very, very large scale, in this case, a marionette. All right. Then we go on to another company. Whereas the previous two were really about form, Mabu Minds is about kind of process more than any other kind of experiment. This particular company was founded in 1970 by Lee Brewer, Joanne Akalaitis, Philip Glass, if you know him as a composer. Look him up. It's very interesting. Mabu Minds famously has a ridiculously long rehearsal process. The development process for one of their plays can take years because it is really kind of the creation of one kind of director who kind of has an idea in the company, and the company helps them develop that idea and iterate it over and over and over and over again to take that kind of seed of an idea and through a very long rehearsal process bring it to fruition. They have elements of, again, puppetry, opera, projection. Often they are non-realistic. They use existing classics as kind of a jumping off point to kind of do their own play and do their own kind of to have plays with their own meaning. An example of this is when I told you that the most performed play out of any in history, or at least right now, is Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House, right? Is Henrik Ibsen, if we remember, is a classic kind of realism, kind of grandfather of realism. But Mabu Minds took that and reinterpreted it and uh, called it Dollhouse. right? Every company member is on the board of directors and is an actor, director, writer, designer, director. Everybody in the company does everything. Now, I saw Dollhouse, and it was very interesting. One of the things that you can kind of get from it, they actually took a doll's house and they set it inside kind of a structure on a stage that kind of looked like a doll's house. And one of the things that they did is they decided in casting to do something extremely specific. All of the women in the play are tall, right? They only cast women in those roles that were, I think, over 6.5 feet tall, or at least 6 feet tall. And they only cast men in those roles who were like under 3 feet tall, right? And so, literally, in the scenes, the and everything in the doll's house would be sized for smaller people. And so the men were extremely comfortable, and all the furniture and stuff was made for them, but the women were extremely uncomfortable. Which, and in the very end, there's a very operatic scene. And so sorry about that pause. At the very end of this particular play, in Ibsen's A Doll's House, um, Torvald and Nora, right, the two main, husband and wife characters of this, she leaves and slams a door, right, and that is a shocking thing, as we remember when we were discussing realism. In this version of it, she actually leaves, and then the whole edifice comes collapsing down, revealing a whole operatic scene full of a whole bunch of puppets singing this opera. And you see her up very high and with like very, very long hair going down to the ground. And she takes it and throws it off, and it turns out to be a wig. And Torvald is having a nightmare. It's all very big and theatrical. Um, but that would be Mabou Mines. There's also the Wooster Group. It was founded in '75, New York, by Spalding Gray, Elizabeth LeCompte, Willem Dafoe, yes, that Willem Dafoe, and others, although it's not called the Wooster Group until 1980. The Wooster Group were some of the first to incorporate more kind of audio-visual effects and elements into their performances, including live streams, but also at the time projections and video on stage. They often performed classics, Shakespeare, Brecht, what have you, just like a lot of these theater companies, but they often kind of discard the text itself, right? And they say, okay, we're going to do Hamlet, but we're not really going to use the text of Hamlet. We're going to perform a play based off of kind of a very loose plot of Hamlet, but just kind of do our own thing. But they also read from found texts, poetry, news reports, fiction, babbling to create kind of what is the text of their show. Then we get to kind of another broad category of experimental theater called immersive theater. Now, this kind of theater, where we usually think of a theater as being, right, you go, you sit down, you see a performance, and then you leave, right? Even in things like a living theater situation, you would go, still sit down, see a performance, get up and leave. But immersive theater is somewhat different. There is no physical separation between the audience's space and the performer's spaces, right? It is often site specific and experiential, right? You would go, and if a performer leaves and goes to another room, you might walk with them into the next room, or you could stay in the room yourself. The most famous show of this kind that is immersive was by a company called Punch Drunk that was founded in 2000 in England. The audience walks around freely in a space where performers may not happen to be at the time, right? This particular piece, Sleep No More, which you can see above, you have these two characters, that's Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, sitting on the side of a bathtub. But everyone on the sides that you can see wearing those white masks, those are all patrons, those are all guests, those are all audience members, right? Who are literally standing, walking around and following, in this particular scene, Macbeth goes down some stairs to go murder Duncan, right? And Lady Macbeth kind of sits there, right? and does another kind of dance in this particular room. And then later on, let's say you choose to stay with Lady M and see what she does. And then, a few minutes later, you see Macbeth coming back up the stairs with blood on his hands and blood on his shirt. Whereas another group of audience members who were following Duncan, let's say, would see Duncan get changed and then Macbeth come down, kill him, and then come back up, right? Um, and so this particular piece, it's like the story of Macbeth told through like the medium of dance. There's very little dialogue, and it's set in kind of like a Hitchcock kind of like early 50s kind of world, and it's experienced like you would a museum, right? You would literally walk around, you can touch things, you can touch props. Yeah, there's even things that you could eat, let's say. um, and another company that does this sort of thing is called Third Rail. It started in 2000 in Brooklyn. Its most famous production is called Then She Fell. It's based upon Lewis Carroll's time in a mental institution, right? The author of Alice in Wonderland. And the performers in that piece actually speak directly to audience members in one-on-one settings, asking them, questions like, how many times have you been in love, let's say? And the audience is invited to handle and explore these different props. Um, I have seen both of those shows. They're very, very interesting. Uh, Anywho, and this is actually a production still from Then She Fell. And just imagine being an audience member experiencing theater, but being the only one in the room with, the Mad Hatter, let's say, who is mixing chemicals to make tinctures and this kind of thing. Anywho, that is kind of a lecture of experimental theater. However many ways you can choose to be experimental, that are the manifold ways that you can have an experimental theater company. Um, I also wanted to say that there is another super secret extra credit opportunity. It's going to be worth 5 points again. If you can message me by, let's say, this Saturday, what your favorite Thanksgiving tradition is, or if you don't have one, what your favorite tradition is around this time of year. It'll be worth 5 points. Thank you all very much. Read Top Dog Underdog and have a nice Thanksgiving. Cheers.